A poor janitor, on his knees in a hospital hallway, begs the only doctor who can save his dying boy. She gives him hope, but then the unthinkable happens. The hospital threatens to shut down the very program keeping his son alive. Just when it seems help is near, a powerful donor suddenly walks away, leaving father and son on the edge of despair. But hidden in the shadows is a shocking connection between the doctor and the boy's late mother, a secret that could change everything. One father's desperate prayer, one doctor's impossible fight, and a miracle that may come from the last place anyone expects. Will this janitor's plea be ignored by the system, or will love and faith be strong enough to save his son's life? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as John Miller drew his mop across the hospital floor in slow, methodical strokes. His weathered hands gripped the wooden handle, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had cleaned these halls for over a decade. The night shift was quieter, lonelier, but it let him stay close to Ethan. The sharp scent of disinfectant filled his nostrils as he wrung out the mop one final time. His muscles ached from the double shift, but John couldn't bring himself to leave just yet. Not without checking on his boy first. He wheeled the cleaning cart to its designated spot in the supply closet, his movements careful and quiet. The squeaky wheel that usually announced his presence throughout the day seemed louder in the hushed evening atmosphere. John stored his supplies with practiced precision, each item in its proper place. The routine usually brought him comfort, but tonight it felt like he was just going through the motions. Outside Ethan's room, John paused. Through the window, the sight of his son made his heart clench. Ethan lay still in the hospital bed, looking small among the tubes and wires that surrounded him. The steady beep of the heart monitor provided a rhythm to the quiet scene. Various machines cast a soft glow across Ethan's pale face, making the 14-year-old look even younger than his years. John pressed his palm against the cool glass, wishing he could reach through and smooth back Ethan's dark hair the way he used to when his son was little. The boy's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, each one a reminder of how fragile life could be. "He's been sleeping most of the evening," a gentle voice said behind him. John turned to find Sarah, one of the night nurses, standing there with a clipboard. Her kind eyes held a warmth that made him feel less alone in the sterile hallway. "Has he eaten anything?" John asked, his voice rough with worry. Sarah shook her head. "Just a few sips of water, but that's normal, considering the medication changes." John nodded, trying to hide how much that information troubled him. Ethan had always been a good eater, even during his worst days. To see his appetite disappearing felt like watching another piece of his vibrant son slip away. "You should go home and rest, Mr. Miller," Sarah suggested softly. "You've been here since dawn." "I will," John lied, knowing he'd probably spend another night in the worn vinyl chair beside Ethan's bed. He couldn't bear the thought of his son waking up alone. Through the window, John watched as Ethan stirred slightly in his sleep. His son's face tightened in discomfort before relaxing again. Each twitch of pain felt like a physical blow to John's chest. "Dad?" Ethan's voice, weak but clear, drifted through the partially open door. John was by his side in an instant, pulling up the familiar chair. "Hey, buddy, I'm here." Ethan's eyes fluttered open, revealing the same warm brown shade as his mother's had been. "You should be home sleeping. And miss our nightly chat? Not a chance." John forced a smile, reaching out to adjust Ethan's blanket. "How are you feeling?" "Like I could run a marathon." Ethan joked weakly, then winced as a wave of pain hit him. "Maybe just a short one." John's throat tightened at his son's attempt at humor even now. That was Ethan, always trying to make things easier for everyone else, even when he was the one suffering. "Save your strength, champ," John said, his voice gentle. "You need your rest." Ethan's hand found his father's, squeezing with what little strength he had. "Dad, I heard the nurses talking earlier." John's heart skipped a beat. "Oh, about the bills." Ethan's eyes filled with concern. "I know it's bad. Maybe we should." "Hey now." John cut him off firmly, but kindly. "That's not something for you to worry about. Your job is to focus on getting better, remember?" Before Ethan could protest, Dr. Thompson appeared in the doorway. The expression on his face made John's stomach drop. "Mr. Miller, could I speak with you for a moment?" John squeezed Ethan's hand. "I'll be right back, buddy." In the hallway, Dr. Thompson's professional demeanor couldn't quite mask his concern. "The latest test results aren't what we hoped for. Ethan's heart function has decreased significantly in the past 24 hours. The words hit John like physical blows. He steadied himself against the wall, feeling the familiar texture of the institutional paint under his palm. "The medication isn't working?" he managed to ask. Dr. Thompson shook his head. "The condition is progressing faster than we anticipated, without surgical intervention soon." He left the sentence unfinished, but John heard the unspoken warning loud and clear. John glanced back through the window at Ethan, who was watching them with worried eyes. His boy, his whole world, lying there getting weaker by the day while John felt powerless to help him. The walls of the corridor seemed to press in around him. The same halls he'd cleaned thousands of times suddenly felt suffocating. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed more intensely, and the antiseptic smell that usually faded into the background now seemed overwhelming. "There has to be something," John whispered, more to himself than to the doctor. "There has to be a way." Dr. Thompson placed a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. "We'll continue monitoring him closely, but you need to prepare yourself. His condition is critical." John barely registered the doctor's departure. He stood there, frozen, as the weight of reality pressed down on him. The steady beep of Ethan's heart monitor drifted through the partially open door, each sound a reminder of precious time slipping away. The cold plastic of the hospital bench pressed against John Miller's back as he slumped down, his work uniform still damp with sweat from mopping floors. In his trembling hands, he held Ethan's baseball cap, the blue one with the local team's logo, now faded from years of summer games and backyard practices. The cloth was worn thin at the brim where Ethan always adjusted it before stepping up to bat. Through the window of room 214, the steady beep of monitors played a haunting melody. John traced his finger along the cap's stitching, remembering the day Ethan had caught his first pop fly. The boy had been so proud, his smile brighter than the summer sun. Now that same boy lay pale and still, connected to more tubes than John could count. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the empty corridor. "I can't lose him too." The words caught in his throat as memories of his late wife Sarah flooded back. The same hospital, different floor, different disease, but the same helpless feeling crushing his chest. The night shift silence wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. A nurse walked past, offering a sympathetic smile that did nothing to ease the weight in his heart. John clutched the cap tighter, pressing it against his chest as if he could somehow transfer his own strength to his son through this treasured piece of cloth. "I'll work harder," he promised to no one in particular, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll pick up more shifts. I'll sell everything we have." The bills kept piling up on his kitchen table at home, each one a reminder of how far beyond his means Ethan's care had become. The words, "final notice," seemed to mock him from every envelope. The overhead lights flickered, making John blink back tears. He'd never been much for praying, Sarah had been the religious one, but now the words spilled out of him like water from a broken dam. "Lord, I know I'm not worthy, but Ethan is. He's such a good boy. He's never hurt anyone. He doesn't deserve this." His shoulders shook as he remembered Ethan's words from earlier that day. "Don't worry, Dad. I'm tough. Remember?" Even now, sick as he was, his son tried to be strong for him. The thought made John's chest tighten with a fresh wave of pain. A cart squeaked somewhere down the hall, and John quickly wiped his eyes with his sleeve. He couldn't let anyone see him break down. He was supposed to be the strong one. But the doctor's words from earlier kept echoing in his head. "His heart is getting weaker. We need to consider more aggressive treatment options." Treatment options they couldn't afford. Insurance they didn't have. A future that seemed to be slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. The baseball cap blurred in his vision as fresh tears welled up. John remembered teaching Ethan to throw his first pitch in their small backyard, how the boy would practice for hours until his arm was sore. "Just like the pros, Dad?" he'd say, his face glowing with determination. Now those same arms lay limp on starched hospital sheets. The sound of confident footsteps echoing down the corridor made John look up. Through his tears, he recognized Dr. Grace Ramirez's white coat as she walked past, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, clipboard in hand. Something inside him snapped, a mixture of desperation and hope that propelled him off the bench. Without thinking, John fell to his knees in front of her, still clutching Ethan's cap. Dr. Ramirez stopped abruptly, her professional demeanor giving way to surprise. "Please," John choked out, looking up at her with eyes full of tears and determination. "Please save my son." The baseball cap trembled in his outstretched hands, a father's humble offering, a symbol of everything he stood to lose. In that fluorescent-lit corridor, a janitor knelt before a doctor, not caring about dignity or protocol, thinking only of the boy in room 214 who needed a miracle. Dr. Grace Ramirez stopped mid-stride, her white coat swishing as she turned to face the man kneeling before her. The sight caught her off guard. A hospital janitor she'd passed 100 times before, now on his knees in the dim corridor, clutching a worn baseball cap like it was his last hope in the world. "Please," John whispered again, his voice cracking. "He's all I have." Grace's clipboard clattered to the floor as she knelt beside him, her hand finding his shoulder. Up close, she could see the deep circles under his eyes, the worry lines etched into his weathered face. "Mr. Miller, please stand up. Let's talk properly." John struggled to his feet, his legs shaky after hours of work. Grace guided him to a nearby bench, the same one where he'd been sitting moments before. Under the fluorescent lights, she noticed how his janitor's uniform hung loose on his frame, telling the story of too many missed meals. "Tell me about Ethan," Grace said softly, picking up her fallen clipboard. John's fingers tightened around the baseball cap. "He's 14. Been sick for months now. His heart. He swallowed hard. The doctors say it's getting worse, and I can't. I don't have." His words trailed off into silence. Grace pulled out her phone, checking the time. 11:42 p.m. Most of the administrative staff had gone home hours ago, but she knew exactly who to call. "Give me a moment," she said, standing up and walking a few steps away. She dialed a number she knew by heart. After 3 rings, a groggy voice answered. "Sarah? It's Grace. Yes, I know what time it is. I need a favor. A big one." John watched as Grace paced the corridor, her voice low but intense as she spoke into the phone. He couldn't make out the words, but he saw her gesturing emphatically, her free hand moving through the air as if conducting an invisible orchestra. After what felt like an eternity, Grace returned to the bench. "Mr. Miller, I've spoken with our charity care coordinator. There's a program. We don't advertise it widely because the funds are limited, but it helps patients who can't afford treatment." Hope flickered across John's tired face. "A program? Yes. We'll need to fill out some paperwork, but I've convinced them to expedite Ethan's case." Grace sat down beside him, her voice gentle but firm. "I can't promise miracles, Mr. Miller, but I promise you this. I will do everything in my power to help your son." Tears welled up in John's eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We have work to do." Grace stood up, straightening her coat. "First, we need to get Ethan transferred to the cardiac care unit. The charity program has beds reserved there." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Grace moved through the hospital halls with purpose, her presence opening doors that had seemed forever closed to John. She spoke with nurses, filled out forms, and made more phone calls. John followed in her wake, signing papers whenever she handed them to him, trying to keep up with the medical terminology that flew past his ears. Finally, around 1 a.m., they stood in a new room on the cardiac floor. The space was larger than Ethan's previous room, with modern equipment humming softly in the background. Through it all, Ethan had barely stirred, his young face peaceful despite the tubes and wires surrounding him. "We'll start new treatments tomorrow," Grace explained, checking Ethan's vital signs on the monitor. "The charity program covers all essential procedures and medications. You won't have to worry about the bills." John sank into the chair beside Ethan's bed, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. The baseball cap still rested in his lap, but his grip had loosened. For the first time in months, He felt the crushing weight on his shoulders begin to lift. "Dr. Ramirez," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Why are you doing all this?" Grace paused at the door, her hand on the light switch. "Because every child deserves a chance, Mr. Miller, and because sometimes the system needs a little push to do the right thing." She smiled softly. "Get some rest. I'll check on Ethan first thing in the morning." As the door closed behind her, John reached out and touched his son's hand. Ethan's fingers were warm, his breathing steady and strong. In the gentle glow of the monitors, John allowed himself to do something he hadn't done in weeks. He smiled. The baseball cap slipped from his lap as his eyes grew heavy, but he didn't pick it up. Instead, he watched Ethan sleep, counting each peaceful breath, until exhaustion finally pulled him into slumber too. For the first time since Ethan's diagnosis, John Miller dared to dream of tomorrow. Morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of room 412, painting warm stripes across Ethan's hospital bed. The steady beeping of monitors created a familiar rhythm that had become the backdrop of their lives. John sat in his usual spot, the hard plastic chair pulled close to his son's bedside, his work uniform wrinkled from sleeping in the same position all night. A gentle knock on the doorframe made both father and son look up. Dr. Grace Ramirez stood there, her dark hair neatly tied back, holding a tablet and wearing a warm smile that reached her eyes. "Good morning," she said, stepping into the room. "I'm Dr. Grace Ramirez, but please, call me Grace." She approached Ethan's bed with a gentle confidence that immediately put John at ease. "And you must be the famous Ethan I've heard so much about." Ethan's pale face brightened slightly. "Famous?" he asked, his voice thin but curious. "Well, any 14-year-old who can quote every baseball statistic from the last 3 seasons is pretty famous in my book," Grace said, glancing at the baseball cap resting on Ethan's bedside table. "Your dad mentioned you're quite the expert." John watched in amazement as his son's eyes lit up, a spark he hadn't seen in weeks. Ethan's fingers fidgeted with his blanket as he asked, "You like baseball?" "My little brother was a huge fan," Grace replied, pulling up a rolling stool to sit beside the bed. "He taught me everything I know about the game." There was a hint of something in her voice, a gentle sadness that John recognized all too well. Grace opened her tablet and began reviewing Ethan's charts. "So, I've been looking over your case, and I want you both to know that we're going to do everything we can to help." She turned to John, her expression serious but kind. "The charity wing has some excellent resources, and I've already started putting together a treatment plan." John's throat tightened. "I don't know how to thank you." Grace held up her hand. "No thanks needed. This is what we're here for." She turned back to Ethan. "Now, young man, I need to do a quick examination. Is that okay?" Ethan nodded, and Grace began her checkup with practiced efficiency. Her movements were gentle as she listened to his heart, checked his blood pressure, and examined the various monitoring devices. All the while, she kept up a steady stream of conversation with Ethan about his favorite teams and players. "Your heart's working pretty hard," she explained, speaking directly to Ethan in a way that made him sit up straighter. "But we're going to help it get stronger. Think of it like spring training. We've got some work to do, but we've got a good game plan." John watched as his son actually smiled at the comparison. It was the first time he'd seen a doctor talk to Ethan like a person rather than a collection of symptoms. "Dad," Ethan said suddenly, "tell Dr. Grace your baseball joke. The really bad one." John felt his face flush. "Oh, I don't think Dr. Grace wants to hear, please?" Ethan's eyes had that mischievous glint that had been missing for so long. "It's so terrible, it's actually good." Grace sat back on her stool, crossing her arms with an amused expression. "Well, now I have to hear it." John rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed but unable to resist his son's request. Okay. Why don't baseball players get along well at dinner?" Grace raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Because they're always trying to steal home." John delivered the punchline with an exaggerated wince. The sound of Ethan's weak laugh filled the room, a sound John had started to fear he might never hear again. It wasn't strong, and it ended in a small cough, but it was real. Grace chuckled too. shaking her head. "That was legitimately terrible," she said, but her eyes were twinkling. "I'm definitely using that one on my next rounds." John watched his son's face, memorizing the moment, the way the morning light caught his smile, the brief color in his cheeks. For the first time in months, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. Grace stood, making a few final notes on her tablet. "All right, Ethan. I'll be back this afternoon to check on you again. We're going to run some tests today, but nothing too scary, I promise." She touched his shoulder gently. "And maybe your dad can work on some better jokes in the meantime." "Not likely," Ethan said with another small laugh, and John felt his heart swell at the sound. Dr. Grace Ramirez sat at her desk in the cardiology department's office, the morning sun warming her back through the window. She thumbed through Ethan Miller's thick medical file, determined to find any detail that might help her treat him better. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her white coat bore the wrinkles of a long night shift. As she flipped through the pages, something caught her eye. She paused, squinting at a familiar name on an old transfer form. "Sarah Miller," she whispered, her heart skipping a beat. Grace pulled open her bottom desk drawer and retrieved a worn leather planner from 6 years ago. With trembling fingers, she leafed through its pages until she found what she was looking for. There it was: Sarah Miller, admitted for complications during pregnancy. Grace remembered her clearly now, a kind-faced woman with warm brown eyes, just like Ethan's. She had been one of Grace's first patients as a resident. "Oh my God," Grace breathed, pressing her hand to her mouth. The coincidence felt too significant to ignore. She remembered Sarah's gentle spirit, how she'd kept smiling despite the pain, always asking how the nursing staff's day was going. And now, here was her son, fighting for his life, in the same hospital. Grace gathered the files and walked quickly through the hospital corridors, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Her mind raced with memories of Sarah, of the complications that had arisen after her delivery. Grace had done everything she could back then, but sometimes everything wasn't enough. Outside Ethan's room, she paused to compose herself. Through the window, she could see John sitting beside his son's bed, reading aloud from what looked like a sports magazine. The scene tugged at her heart, a father's unwavering devotion, so similar to how Sarah had spoken about her family during their brief time together. Grace knocked softly and entered the room. The familiar hospital sounds, the steady beep of monitors, the distant squeak of cartwheels filled the quiet space. Ethan had dozed off, his baseball cap resting on the bedside table. "Mr. Miller?" Grace said softly. "Could we talk for a moment?" John looked up, his tired eyes showing immediate concern. "Is everything okay, Dr. Ramirez?" "Yes, everything's fine," she assured him quickly. "Would you mind stepping into the hallway with me?" John carefully stood, trying not to disturb Ethan. He followed Grace into the corridor, where the morning light streamed through large windows, casting long shadows on the floor. "Mr. Miller," Grace began, then paused, clutching the files to her chest. "John, I discovered something while reviewing Ethan's records." She took a deep breath. "I knew your wife, Sarah. I was one of her doctors, 6 years ago." John's eyes widened, and he reached out to steady himself against the wall. You knew Sarah?" Grace nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "I was a resident then. She was one of my first patients. I remember her clearly, her kindness, her strength. She talked about you and Ethan all the time." John's shoulders trembled slightly. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they were wet with tears. "Sarah always said there were angels in this hospital," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She'd tell Ethan stories about the doctors and nurses who took care of her." Grace reached out and touched John's arm gently. "She was special. The kind of patient you never forget. She fought so hard, right until the end." "She did?" John agreed, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Everything good in Ethan comes from her. His smile, his courage, the way he never complains, even when things are at their worst." They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in memories of Sarah. The morning bustle of the hospital continued around them, but in their small corner of the corridor, time seemed to stand still. "I don't believe in coincidences," Dr. Ramirez, John said finally, looking at her with newfound wonder. When I knelt before you yesterday, I was at my lowest point. I didn't know what else to do, but maybe, his voice caught, maybe Sarah had a hand in bringing you back into our lives. Grace felt her professional composure crack slightly. I think she did, she whispered. And I promise you, John, I'll fight just as hard for Ethan as she would have. We're not going to lose him. John nodded, unable to speak. Grace understood some moments were beyond words. They stood together in the gentle morning light, united by the memory of a woman who had touched both their lives and by their shared determination to save her son. Through the window they could see Ethan sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling steadily. His mother's spirit seemed to fill the quiet space between them, a presence that brought not sadness, but a renewed sense of purpose and hope. The hospital boardroom felt colder than the rest of the building. Grace sat straight-backed in her chair, surrounded by 12 men and women in expensive suits. Their faces showed polite attention, but their eyes were distant. Spreadsheets and financial reports cluttered the long mahogany table. Dr. Ramirez, said Mr. Harrison, the board chairman, we understand your concern for the Miller boy, but we have to consider the bigger picture. Grace leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. Ethan's condition is getting worse. Without this surgery, he won't make it to his next birthday. We're talking about a child's life. Mrs. Peterson, the financial director, adjusted her glasses. The charity program is already stretched thin. This surgery would cost over $200. A cost we can absolutely handle, Grace countered. Our hospital made record profits last quarter. Profits that are already allocated to necessary upgrades, Mr. Harrison said, shuffling through some papers. New equipment, building maintenance. More important than saving a 14-year-old boy? Grace's voice rose slightly. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. His father works here. John Miller has been our janitor for 15 years. He works double shifts, never complains, and now his son needs our help. We sympathize, said Dr. Roberts, an older board member who hadn't practiced medicine in a decade. But if we make an exception for one case, where do we draw the line? Grace pulled out Ethan's latest test results. Look at these numbers. His heart function is declining rapidly. We have a window of opportunity, but it's closing fast. She passed the papers around, but few board members even glanced at them. Dr. Ramirez. Mrs. Peterson said, her tone patronizing, you're an excellent physician, but you need to understand the business side of healthcare. We can't save everyone. We're not talking about everyone, Grace said. We're talking about Ethan, a bright, brave kid who loves baseball and helps other patients feel better despite his own pain. His father mops these very floors every night so we can work in a clean environment. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. Perhaps we should discuss the larger issue at hand. Grace felt her stomach tighten. What larger issue? Mrs. Peterson opened another folder. The charity program itself. We've been reviewing its impact on our bottom line, and frankly, the numbers don't support continuing it. The room seemed to tilt. Grace gripped the edge of the table. You can't be serious. That program helps dozens of patients every year. Dozens who can't pay, Dr. Roberts pointed out. Meanwhile, we turn away insured patients because those beds are occupied. So we're just going to abandon people who need us most? Grace looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes. What happened to our mission statement about serving the community? Mr. Harrison's face hardened. The community is best served by a financially stable hospital. We're not a charity organization, Dr. Ramirez. We're a business. A business that exists to save lives, Grace shot back. She pulled out one more document, a photo of Ethan, smiling from his hospital bed. This is who we're talking about, not a number on a spreadsheet. A real person, a child. The board members shifted uncomfortably, but their expressions didn't change. Mrs. Peterson spoke first. We'll take your concerns under advisement, Doctor. But as of next month, we're phasing out the charity program. Current patients will need to be transferred or make other arrangements. Grace stood up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You can't do this. These people have nowhere else to go." "The decision has been made," Mr. Harrison said firmly. "We'll make the announcement next week. Until then, this information is confidential." Grace gathered her papers with shaking hands. Her throat felt tight as she walked to the door. She paused, turning back one last time. "When you all go home tonight, look in the mirror and ask yourselves if this is why you got into healthcare." The hallway felt endless as Grace walked back to the cardiac wing. Her white coat seemed heavier than usual. Nurses and patients greeted her, but she barely heard them. All she could think about was John's face, when she'd promised to help Ethan, the faith he'd placed in her. She found John in his usual spot, mopping the floor outside Ethan's room. He looked up with hopeful eyes when he saw her. "Dr. Ramirez, how did the meeting go?" Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes. The mop handle slipped from John's hands as he saw her expression. "Dr. Ramirez?" His voice cracked. "Grace?" She wiped her eyes quickly, but couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. "John, I'm so sorry. The board. They're not just denying Ethan's surgery. They're ending the entire charity program." The mop clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the quiet hallway. John stared at her, his face draining of color as the weight of those words settled over them both like a heavy shadow. John's mop made soft swishing sounds against the polished floor of the hospital's private wing. The scent of lemon cleaner hung in the air as he worked methodically, moving from one pristine tile to the next. His shoulders ached from hours of the same repeated motion, but he kept going. The work helped quiet his mind, even if just a little. "I simply cannot believe they expect me to eat this food," a woman's voice carried from one of the luxury suites. "The salmon is completely overdone. Marcus, call down to the kitchen again." John's jaw tightened as he continued mopping. Through the open door, he could see the patient, a middle-aged woman propped up on several pillows, her hospital bed adjusted to the perfect angle. A flat-screen TV mounted on the wall played some reality show, while her husband spoke quietly into his phone. "And these sheets," the woman continued, "they're not even Egyptian cotton. I thought this was supposed to be the best hospital in the state." John's grip on the mop handle strengthened until his knuckles turned white. He thought of Ethan's room, 2 floors below, plain walls, a small window, and a bed that creaked whenever his son shifted position. No flat-screen TV, no fancy meals. Just beeping monitors and IV drips that kept his boy alive. Moving down the hallway, John passed another suite where a businessman was arguing loudly on his phone. "I don't care what the doctor says. I'm not staying another night. I have a golf tournament this weekend." The man's voice grew louder as John cleaned nearby. "Look, it's just high blood pressure. They're being overcautious. Book me a tea time for Saturday morning." John's mop water had grown dirty. He wheeled his bucket to the maintenance closet, fighting back the bitter taste in his mouth. While he dumped out the old water, a young couple walked past, the woman in designer yoga wear despite being a patient. "The wait times here are ridiculous," she complained to her companion. "I've been here 3 hours just for some routine tests. Don't they know who we are?" John filled his bucket with fresh water, adding the measured amount of cleaning solution. His hands shook slightly as he did so. These people had no idea how lucky they were. They could afford the best care, the finest rooms, any treatment they needed. While his son, he thought of Ethan's brave smile earlier that day, how the boy had tried to hide his wincing when the nurses drew more blood. "It's okay, Dad," Ethan had said. "I'm tough, remember?" Back in the hallway, John worked his way toward the nurses' station. 2 doctors stood nearby, speaking in hushed tones. "Did you hear about the charity program?" one asked. "Yeah. They're shutting it down. Budget cuts, they say." "Shame. Some of those kids really need the help." John's chest tightened. He wanted to turn around, to tell these doctors about Ethan, about all the other children who deserved a chance at life. But he kept mopping, invisible as always. Near the end of his shift, John paused outside another luxury suite. Inside, a young boy about Ethan's age played video games on a large iPad. His mother sat nearby, complaining into her phone about the hospital's parking fees. The boy had a cast on his arm, a broken bone, nothing more. He would heal, go home, return to his normal life. The unfairness of it all hit John like a physical blow. In the staff break room, John found himself alone. His hands trembled as he pulled out his worn notebook, the one where he kept Ethan's medication schedule and doctor's instructions. He flipped to a blank page and began to write. "To the hospital board," he started, then crossed it out. His handwriting was shaky, but he tried again. "To anyone who will listen. My name is John Miller. I am a father." The words came slowly at first, then faster. He wrote about Ethan, about the other families he'd met in the charity wing. He wrote about sleepless nights spent watching his son struggle to breathe, about working double shifts to afford basic medications. "Every child deserves a chance to live," he wrote. "Every parent deserves the chance to save their child." John's vision blurred with tears, but he kept writing. He couldn't match the wealthy patient's money or influence, but he had something they didn't: the raw truth of a father fighting for his son's life. The petition began taking shape on the paper. His hand still trembled, but his purpose grew clearer with each word. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He wasn't invisible. He was a father with a voice, and he would make them hear it. Outside the break room window, the night sky had turned pitch black. John's shift had ended an hour ago, but he kept writing. For Ethan, for every child like him, for every parent who had ever felt helpless against a system that valued wealth over life. His words filled page after page, powered by years of quiet observation and pent-up frustration. The wealthy patient's complaints from earlier echoed in his mind, driving his pen forward. Egyptian cotton sheets and golf tournaments seemed obscene compared to children fighting for their next breath. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as John drafted his petition. His back ached from hunching over the small table, but he barely noticed. Each word felt like a step forward, a tiny piece of hope taking shape on the paper before him. The hospital cafeteria was nearly empty at this late hour. A few nurses grabbed quick bites between shifts, and the occasional orderly shuffled through with a coffee cup. In the far corner, away from everyone else, John Miller stood facing Dr. Grace Ramirez, his weathered hands clutching a wrinkled piece of paper. "I'm not good at this, Dr. Ramirez," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe someone else should speak instead." Grace shook her head, her dark eyes kind but determined. "No, John. Your words will mean more coming from you. You're Ethan's father. You're the one who's lived this struggle every day." She gestured to the paper in his hands. "Just read what you wrote. Pretend I'm the community board." John cleared his throat, looking down at his own messy handwriting. "My name is John Miller." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry, my mouth's too dry." Grace reached into her white coat pocket and pulled out a small water bottle. "Here. Take a sip and try again. Remember to breathe." The cool water helped steady his nerves. John straightened his shoulders slightly, though his hands still trembled. "My name is John Miller. I'm a janitor at Memorial Hospital. And my son Ethan is 14 years old. He has." His voice cracked. "That's good," Grace encouraged. "Keep going. Tell them about Ethan." John took another breath. "He has a rare heart condition. The doctors say he needs surgery, but we can't afford it. I work double shifts, sometimes triple shifts, but it's not enough." His voice grew slightly stronger. "Ethan loves baseball. He used to play Little League before he got sick. Now he can barely walk up a flight of stairs without getting winded." Grace nodded, leaning forward in her chair. "That's perfect, John. You're helping them see Ethan as a real person, not just a case number." Encouraged by her words, John continued. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance to save my boy. Every child deserves that chance, no matter how much money their parents have." His voice grew clearer, more confident. "The hospital's charity program gave us hope, but now they want to end it. How many other children will be turned away? How many other parents will have to watch their kids suffer because they can't afford treatment?" A few of the nurses in the cafeteria had stopped eating to listen. John didn't notice them, focused entirely on his speech. "That's exactly right," Grace said softly. "Keep that emotion in your voice, but stay controlled. You want them to feel your pain without feeling overwhelmed by it." John nodded, his grip on the paper loosening slightly as he found his rhythm. "I clean these halls every night. I see million-dollar equipment sitting unused while children like my son wait for help. I'm not asking anyone to solve all the world's problems. I'm just asking for compassion, for mercy, for a system that sees the value of every life, not just the ones who can afford it." When he finished, there was complete silence in the cafeteria. One of the nurses wiped her eyes quickly with a napkin. "John, that was beautiful," Grace said, standing up. "Now we just need to get you comfortable saying it in front of more people." 2 days later, John found himself standing in the basement of the local community center. About 20 people sat in folding chairs, most of them looking tired after long workdays. Some scrolled through their phones, barely paying attention. Grace sat in the front row, giving him an encouraging nod. John pulled the same wrinkled paper from his pocket, though he barely needed it anymore. He'd practiced those words countless times in the mirror, in empty hospital corridors, even while mopping floors. "My name is John Miller," he began, his voice shaky but clear enough to be heard. As he spoke about Ethan, about baseball, and breathing troubles and shattered dreams, a few phones lowered. People started to look up, really look at him. When he reached the part about working triple shifts, a woman in a waitress uniform nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. Another man, wearing paint-spattered work boots, leaned forward in his chair. "I'm not asking for charity," John said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm asking for a chance to save my boy." He looked around the room, making eye contact with several people. Every child deserves that chance. By the time he finished speaking about compassion and mercy, about seeing the value in every life, more heads were nodding. The woman in the waitress uniform wiped her eyes. The man in work boots crossed his arms, his jaw set with determination. It wasn't a standing ovation. The room didn't erupt in cheers. But John saw something spark in those tired faces: recognition, understanding, the first stirrings of support. These were people who knew what it meant to struggle, to fight against a system that often seemed stacked against them. Grace stood up first, thanking everyone for coming. As people began to file out, several stopped to shake John's hand or pat his shoulder. "We're with you," the waitress whispered as she passed. "My kid was in the hospital last year, I know how it is." The man in work boots lingered behind. "I know some people at the union," he said gruffly. "Maybe they'd want to hear your story too." The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital's main entrance as John Miller stood near the sliding glass doors, a stack of freshly printed flyers in his trembling hands. He'd spent hours at the library yesterday, carefully typing out his message and making copies with quarters borrowed from his laundry jar. "Please, take a moment to read this," John said softly to a woman in a business suit who hurried past without a glance. His shoulders slumped slightly, but he straightened them again, remembering Ethan's brave smile. The morning rush continued, a steady stream of people flowing in and out of the hospital doors. Most rushed past, their eyes fixed ahead or on their phones. John's voice grew a little stronger with each attempt. "Would you like to learn about the hospital's charity care program?" he asked an elderly gentleman who actually paused to look at him. "What's this about?" the man asked, accepting a flyer. His eyes scanned the page, brows furrowing. "They're shutting down the program?" John nodded, his voice catching. "My son, he needs heart surgery. But there are other kids too, other families who—" The man's face softened. "My grandson was treated here last year, couldn't have afforded it without insurance." He folded the flyer carefully and tucked it in his pocket. "I'll share this with my church group." This small victory gave John renewed energy. He smiled at a young nurse who slowed her pace as she approached. "Good morning," he said, offering her a flyer. She glanced around nervously before taking it. "I've seen you cleaning the pediatric ward," she whispered. I hope you get the support you need." She hurried inside, but John saw her showing the flyer to another nurse at the reception desk. A security guard approached, and John's heart sank. But instead of asking him to leave, the guard just nodded. "Stay on the public sidewalk, sir, and you'll be fine." The morning wore on. John's feet ached from standing, and his throat felt dry, but he kept at it. A local news photographer stopped to take a picture, though John wasn't sure it would lead to anything. A few medical students read his flyer with interest, asking thoughtful questions about the charity program. Around noon, Dr. Grace passed by on her lunch break. She pretended not to know him. Hospital politics required discretion, but she gave him an encouraging smile. It reminded him of their practice session in the cafeteria yesterday, how she'd helped him find the right words. "Sir?" A woman in her 40s touched his arm. "My daughter was saved by charity care 10 years ago. She had leukemia." Her eyes welled with tears. "What can I do to help?" John handed her several flyers. "Share these? Come to the community meeting next week?" His voice grew stronger. "Every voice matters. I'll be there," she promised. "And I'll bring others." By mid-afternoon, John's stack of flyers had dwindled. His back ached, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in days. Even those who hadn't taken flyers had seen him, the invisible janitor becoming visible, standing up for something bigger than himself. During his dinner break, John visited Ethan's room, carrying one of his last flyers. His son was propped up in bed, looking pale but alert, working on a puzzle one of the nurses had brought him. "How'd it go, Dad?" Ethan asked, his eyes bright with interest. John shared the day's small victories, watching his son's face light up with each story. "Some people really listened," he said. "Really cared." Ethan held out his hand for the flyer, reading it carefully. "You wrote this?" Pride filled his voice. "It's really good, Dad." John watched as his son reached for a roll of tape on his bedside table, left there from when they'd hung up his baseball pennant. With careful movements, Ethan tore off 2 pieces of tape and secured the flyer to the wall beside his bed. "Go, Dad," Ethan whispered, his eyes shining with more than just fever. John had to turn away to hide his own tears. His son's faith in him felt bigger than all his doubts, stronger than any fear of failure. In that moment, he knew he would keep fighting. Not just for Ethan, but for every child who needed help, for every parent who felt as lost and scared as he had. The small church was quiet, except for the gentle hum of ceiling fans and the rustling of Sunday bulletins. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews where John Miller sat, his heart hammering against his ribs. Pastor Samuel Green's sermon had just ended, and John knew this was his moment to speak. The pastor had kindly offered him these few minutes, but now that the time had come, John's mouth felt dry as cotton. He clutched his worn Bible, its pages marked with the notes he'd carefully prepared. Dr. Grace Ramirez sat supportively in the back row, having accepted his nervous invitation to attend. And now, Pastor Samuel's warm voice carried through the sanctuary. "We have a member of our community who'd like to share something important with us. John Miller, please come forward." John's legs felt like lead as he stood. He made his way to the front, acutely aware of every creaking floorboard beneath his feet. These were his neighbors, the people he saw at the grocery store and post office. Yet speaking to them all at once made his stomach twist in knots. Reaching the pulpit, John cleared his throat and looked out at the sea of familiar faces. Mrs. Thompson, who always brought casseroles to church potlucks. Mr. Rodriguez, who ran the hardware store. And there in the third row, Margaret Wells, a retired nurse he recognized from the hospital. "Good morning," John began, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced down at his Bible, then back up, remembering Grace's coaching about making eye contact. "Most of you know me as the quiet janitor at Memorial Hospital. Some of you might have seen me mopping floors or emptying trash bins. But today, I'm here as a father." His voice grew stronger as he thought of Ethan. "My son, my 14-year-old boy Ethan, is fighting for his life in that same hospital. He has a heart condition that needs surgery we couldn't afford without the hospital's charity care program." John paused, swallowing hard. "But now they're planning to shut that program down." A murmur rippled through the congregation. John saw several people lean forward in their pews. "Ethan." John's voice cracked slightly. He gripped the edges of the pulpit. "Ethan loves baseball. He used to pitch for the junior league team. Now he can barely walk across his hospital room without getting winded. But he never complains. He just asks when he can play again." Margaret Wells dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. In the back, Grace sat straight and proud, nodding encouragement. "The charity program isn't just about my son," John continued, growing more confident. "It's about all the children who need help. All the families who work hard but still can't afford the care their loved ones need." When Jesus healed the sick, he didn't ask to see their insurance cards first. A few amens echoed through the sanctuary. Pastor Samuel, standing nearby, smiled warmly. "I'm asking for your help," John said, his voice steady now. "I have a petition. If we can show the hospital board how many people care about this program, maybe they'll change their minds. Maybe they'll see that every life is precious, regardless of what's in their wallet." Margaret Wells stood up, her silver hair catching the sunlight. "I worked at Memorial for 30 years, she announced clearly. "John's right. I've seen too many families torn apart by medical bills. Count me in." Pastor Samuel stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on John's shoulder. "The church will help," he declared. "We can set up a table in the fellowship hall for people to sign the petition. And I'll speak to the other churches in town." John felt warmth spread through his chest as more people began standing. Mr. Rodriguez raised his hand. "My print shop can make more copies of the petition, no charge." Mrs. Thompson wiped her eyes. "My women's group meets on Wednesday. We'll get signatures there." After the service, John and Grace stood in the fellowship hall, watching as a line formed at the petition table. Margaret Wells had taken charge, explaining the situation to anyone who hesitated. Pastor Samuel moved through the crowd, speaking quietly to small groups. "Look at this," Grace whispered, gesturing to the growing stack of signed papers. Her eyes sparkled with unshed tears. "This is how change begins." John watched as another parishioner added their name to the petition. His throat felt tight with emotion. For the first time since hearing about the program's closure, he felt real hope blooming in his chest. These weren't just signatures on paper, they were promises, prayers, and the beginning of something bigger than himself. The fellowship hall buzzed with conversation as more people gathered around the petition table. Someone had brought out coffee and cookies, turning the signature drive into an impromptu community meeting. John observed it all with quiet amazement, remembering how alone he'd felt just days ago, mopping those endless hospital corridors. "Your words touch their hearts," Grace said softly, standing beside him. "They see what I saw that night in the hospital, a father's love that won't give up." John nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Through the church windows, he could see the hospital's white buildings in the distance. Somewhere in those walls, Ethan was probably looking out his own window, wondering how his father's speech had gone. Soon, John would return to tell him about this morning, about how their neighbors had stood up to help, about how they weren't fighting alone anymore. The small news van from Channel 7 looked out of place in the hospital parking lot, its bright blue logo catching the afternoon sun. John Miller tugged at his collar, wondering if he should have worn something nicer than his cleanest work shirt. Sarah Chen, the young reporter with perfectly styled hair and a crisp blazer, adjusted her microphone while her cameraman set up the equipment. "Just relax, Mr. Miller," Sarah said kindly. "Think of this as a conversation between friends. Tell me about Ethan, about your journey." John nodded, his hands fidgeting in his lap. They sat on a bench outside the hospital entrance, where he'd mopped countless times. Dr. Grace had helped arrange this interview, convinced that getting their story on local news would help their cause. "Ready when you are, Sarah," the cameraman called out. Sarah turned to face the camera, her expression professional but warm. "I'm here at Metro Community Hospital with John Miller, a father fighting not just for his son's life, but for all families facing similar struggles. Mr. Miller, tell us about your son." John took a deep breath. "Ethan. He's 14. He loves baseball more than anything. Used to pitch for his school team before." His voice caught for a moment, before his heart started giving him trouble. "What exactly is your son facing?" "He has a rare heart condition. Needs surgery, but insurance won't cover it. I work here at the hospital as a janitor, doing double shifts when I can, but the bills." John's eyes grew distant. "They're more than I could earn in years." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "And now I understand the hospital's charity program, which was helping your son, is being shut down?" "Yes, ma'am. They say it's budget cuts, but—" John's voice grew stronger, passionate. "Every child deserves a chance at life, not just those whose parents can afford it. Ethan, he's such a good kid. Never complains, always trying to make me smile even when he's hurting." The cameraman zoomed in as John pulled out Ethan's worn baseball cap from his pocket. "This is his lucky cap. He made me promise to keep it safe until he can wear it again on the field." Sarah's professional demeanor softened. "You've started a petition?" "Yes. We're gathering signatures, trying to convince the hospital board to keep the program running. Dr. Grace Ramirez. She's been helping us. She believes in Ethan, in all the kids who need help. What would you say to people watching who might want to help?" John looked directly into the camera, his earlier nervousness replaced by determination. "We're not asking for handouts. We're asking for a chance. Every parent in this situation would work themselves to the bone for their child. I know I do. But sometimes, working hard isn't enough. Sometimes we need our community to stand with us." The interview continued, with John sharing stories about Ethan's courage, about the small acts of kindness from hospital staff, about his hope for the future. When Sarah asked about his late wife, John's eyes grew misty, but his voice remained steady. "She'd be fighting right alongside us. She always said every life matters, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant." After the interview wrapped up, Sarah squeezed John's hand. "This will air tonight at 6. You did wonderfully, Mr. Miller. Your sincerity, that's something you can't fake." Later that evening, John sat beside Ethan's hospital bed, both watching the small TV mounted on the wall. The regular programming cut to the evening news, and suddenly there was John on the screen, looking both nervous and determined. Ethan's face lit up. "Dad, you're on TV." John watched himself speak, barely recognizing the passionate advocate he saw on screen. The story was beautifully edited, showing shots of the hospital, close-ups of Ethan's baseball cap, and interviews with Dr. Grace about the importance of the charity program. When the segment ended, Ethan turned to his father with shining eyes. "You're famous, Dad," John chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "Not famous, buddy. Just a dad trying his best. But look!" Ethan pointed to his phone, which had been lighting up with notifications. "People are already sharing the story online. My friends from school are texting me about it." John glanced at his own phone, seeing messages from church members and even a few colleagues. The story was spreading faster than he'd imagined possible. Maybe, just maybe, their small voice would be heard after all. Ethan yawned, the excitement of the evening catching up with his weakened body. "Dad? Yeah, buddy? I'm proud of you. Like, really proud." His voice was sleepy but sincere. John's throat tightened with emotion. He tucked the blanket around his son, just as he'd done countless times before. "Get some rest, champ. We've got more fighting to do tomorrow." As Ethan drifted off to sleep, John watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, the gentle beeping of monitors, a familiar lullaby. The baseball cap sat on the bedside table, a symbol of hope and everything they were fighting for. His son's words echoed in his mind. "You're famous, Dad." No, not famous, John thought. Just a father who'd finally found his voice. The morning after the news broadcast, John opened his locker in the hospital's basement staff room and found 3 white envelopes tucked inside. His weathered hands trembled as he carefully opened the first one. Inside was a simple note written in neat handwriting, "For Ethan," along with $40. The second envelope contained $60, and the third held a $20 and a small card that read, "Keep fighting, we're with you." John pressed his palm against the cold metal of his locker, steadying himself. These weren't large amounts, but they represented something far more valuable than money. They showed him he wasn't alone anymore. Throughout his morning shift, John noticed subtle changes in how the hospital staff treated him. Nurses who had barely acknowledged him before now gave him encouraging smiles. An orderly patted his shoulder as they passed in the corridor. Even Dr. Martinez from Pediatrics stopped him to say he'd seen the news story and was deeply moved. "Your locker's getting pretty full," whispered Nancy, a veteran nurse who'd been at the hospital for 20 years. She slipped him another envelope while pretending to check a supply closet. "We can't do much openly, hospital policy and all that. But we're behind you, John." By lunchtime, Dr. Grace Ramirez found John sitting alone in the cafeteria, staring at a growing stack of envelopes. She pulled up a chair, her face bright with excitement. "The story's gone viral locally," she said, showing him her phone. "People are sharing it all over social media. Look at these comments." John squinted at the screen, reading slowly. Messages of support filled the page. This is what healthcare should be about. No parent should have to beg for their child's life. Where can we donate? That's not all, Grace continued, her voice dropping to an excited whisper. Remember Barbara from accounting? She's been keeping track of all the small donations coming in through the hospital's charitable foundation. People are specifically mentioning Ethan's case. John pushed his untouched sandwich aside, overwhelmed. I never expected. I'm just a janitor. You're a father fighting for his son, Grace corrected firmly. And you're showing everyone what that really means. That afternoon, while John was cleaning the emergency room waiting area, a group of volunteers from the local church arrived wearing matching t-shirts with "Save the Charity Wing" printed on them. They set up an information table in the hospital lobby, having already secured proper permits. Their presence drew curious looks from visitors and staff alike. Mary Thompson, the retired nurse from John's church, led the volunteer effort. She had organized a phone bank to call community members and gather more signatures for the petition. We've got 15 people making calls every evening, she told John during her break. The response has been incredible. Even some of the regular patients joined the cause. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who came in for weekly dialysis, spent her treatment time addressing envelopes for awareness campaigns. Mr. Rodriguez, waiting for his wife during her chemotherapy, shared Ethan's story with everyone in the waiting room. By week's end, Dr. Grace Ramirez's office had become an unofficial headquarters for the movement. Her desk disappeared under stacks of signed petitions and letters of support. She organized everything meticulously, preparing for the upcoming board presentation. We've got over 5,000 signatures, Grace announced one evening as John finished his shift. She was surrounded by neat piles of papers, her reading glasses perched on her nose. And the foundation reports small donations totaling nearly $15,000. It's not enough for the surgery yet, but it shows community support. John leaned against the doorframe, still in his blue maintenance uniform. I never thought so many people would care about a stranger's kid. That's just it, John. You and Ethan aren't strangers anymore. You've given this cause a face, a story people can connect with. Grace gathered the papers into a professional-looking portfolio. The board meeting is tomorrow morning. I've been granted 15 minutes to present our case. The next morning, Grace stood before the hospital board in her crisp white coat, the portfolio laid out before her. The board members, seated around a large mahogany table, watched with varying degrees of interest as she began her presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Grace started, her voice clear and confident. I'm here today with evidence of overwhelming community support for our charity care program. She opened the portfolio, revealing the meticulously organized petitions. These 5,000 signatures represent more than just names on paper. They represent our community's belief that healthcare should be accessible to all, regardless of ability to pay. She proceeded to outline the grassroots movement that had sprung up around Ethan's case, the volunteer efforts, and the spontaneous donations from staff and community members. As she spoke, several board members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from polite attention to genuine interest. The board chair, Dr. Harrison, adjusted his glasses as he examined the signature pages. This is quite impressive, Dr. Ramirez. And you say all this developed organically? Yes, sir. Started by a father's plea for his son and embraced by an entire community. Grace laid out the financial reports from the foundation. These donations, though modest, demonstrate our community's willingness to support this program. They're investing in their hospital, in their neighbors. The room fell silent as the board members exchanged glances. Finally, Dr. Harrison cleared his throat. Well, Dr. Ramirez, you've certainly given us something to consider. I believe this warrants a formal review of the charity care program's future. We'll schedule a full hearing for next week. Grace gathered her materials, maintaining her professional composure despite the surge of hope she felt. Thank you, sir. The community will be grateful for this opportunity. Outside the boardroom, she found John waiting anxiously, his mop forgotten against the wall. The look of cautious optimism on his face made all her efforts worthwhile. They had achieved their first real victory, the chance to be heard. John Miller stood before the hospital board, his janitor's uniform freshly pressed, but his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edges of the wooden podium. The boardroom felt impossibly large, with its polished mahogany table stretching out before him and stern faces studying him from leather chairs. Dr. Grace Ramirez sat to his right, her presence a silent anchor of support. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the carpeted floor. John could feel the weight of his son's worn baseball cap in his pocket, the one thing he'd brought for courage. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "Thank you for hearing me today," he began, his voice softer than he intended. He paused, took a deep breath, and remembered Grace's coaching from their practice sessions in the cafeteria. "I've worked in this hospital for 15 years, cleaning these halls every night. I've seen thousands of patients come and go. But today, I'm not here as your janitor, I'm here as a father." The board chairman, Dr. Harrison, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly. Other members shuffled papers or tapped their pens, their expressions unchanged. "My son, Ethan," John continued, his voice growing stronger. "He's 14 years old. He loves baseball in science class, and he wants to be a doctor someday." John pulled out the baseball cap, holding it gently. "But right now, he's fighting for his life in room 412. And he's not the only one. There are other children in the charity wing, other families who need help." Grace nodded encouragingly, her eyes bright with emotion. John straightened his shoulders, drawing strength from her support. "I understand budget concerns. Every night I count the cleaning supplies, making sure we don't waste a single bottle. But this isn't about supplies or budgets. It's about lives, children's lives." A woman board member dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. John pressed on, his words coming from deep within his heart. "When my wife died, I promised her I'd take care of our boy. I've worked double shifts, sold our car, moved to a smaller apartment. But it's not enough. The medical bills." His voice cracked slightly. "They're more than I'll earn in 10 years. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "These are signatures. Over 2,000 people from our community who believe in keeping the charity program alive. Church members, teachers, nurses, even some of your own staff." The board members exchanged glances. Dr. Harrison's stern expression softened slightly. "Yesterday, I found these in my locker." John pulled out the 3 envelopes. "Hospital staff, people who barely make enough themselves, giving what they can to help, not just for Ethan, but for every child who needs care." Grace stood up then, moving to stand beside John. "If I may add something?" she asked. At Dr. Harrison's nod, she continued, "The charity program costs this hospital money, yes, but it gives us something far more valuable, our humanity. It reminds us why we became healthcare providers in the first place." John looked at each board member in turn, his voice steady now. "I clean these halls every night, and I see the motto carved above your entrance, healing with compassion. I believe in those words. I have to believe in them, because my son's life depends on it. And not just Ethan's life, all the children in that wing, all the families hoping and praying for a miracle." The boardroom fell silent. Even the usual sounds of the hospital seemed muted, as if the whole building was holding its breath. Dr. Harrison removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly with a handkerchief. "Mr. Miller, your dedication to your son is admirable. And Dr. Ramirez, your advocacy for the program is noted." He paused, looking around at the other board members. "However, good intentions don't pay bills. This hospital must remain financially viable." "What if we could secure additional funding?" Grace interjected. "Give us time to find donors, organize fundraisers. The community is already rallying behind this cause." Several board members huddled together, whispering. John stood quietly, his hand touching Ethan's cap for strength. After what felt like hours, Dr. Harrison spoke again. "Very well. We will maintain the charity program on one condition. If sufficient funding can be secured within the next 30 days to cover operational costs for the remainder of the year. Dr. DTFSTAEDE. Ramirez, you'll need to present a viable financial plan." John's knees felt weak with relief. Grace squeezed his arm supportively. "Thank you," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving us a chance." As the board members began gathering their things, several of them approached John, shaking his hand or offering quiet words of encouragement. Dr. Harrison was the last to leave, pausing at the door. "Mr. Miller," he said, turning back. "That was quite a speech for a janitor." John straightened his shoulders. "Sir, I may be a janitor, but I'm a father first." The chairman nodded slowly, a hint of respect in his eyes, before leaving the room. John sank into a chair, his legs finally giving out. Grace sat beside him, both of them letting out long breaths of relief. They had won the first battle, but the war wasn't over. They had 30 days to save the program, to save Ethan and all the other children who needed help. John's footsteps echoed through the hospital corridor as he rushed toward Ethan's room, his heart pounding with a mix of exhaustion and hope. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed brighter somehow, casting a warm glow that matched the feeling spreading through his chest. He'd shed his suit jacket somewhere along the way, his tie loosened and fluttering as he moved. When he reached room 412, he paused for just a moment to catch his breath. Through the window, he could see Ethan propped up in bed, thumbing through his favorite baseball magazine. The sight of his son, still pale but alert, made John's eyes well up with tears. He pushed open the door, and Ethan's head snapped up immediately. "Dad!" The magazine fell, forgotten, to his lap. "Hey, buddy." John's voice was thick with emotion as he crossed the room in 3 quick strides. He settled on the edge of Ethan's bed, careful not to disturb any of the monitoring equipment. "How did it go?" Ethan's eyes were wide and hopeful, his thin fingers fidgeting with his blanket. "Did they listen?" John nodded, a smile breaking across his tired face. "They did, son. They really did." He reached out to smooth Ethan's messy hair. "The board agreed to keep the program running if we can secure the funding." Ethan's face lit up like a sunrise. Despite his weakness, he lurched forward and wrapped his arms around his father's middle. "We're going to win, Dad," he whispered into John's shirt, his voice muffled but full of conviction. John held his son close, breathing in the familiar hospital soap smell of his hair. "We've got a real chance now, buddy. A real chance." Later that evening, as the sun began to set, John stood at Ethan's window, amazed by the sight below. What had started as a small gathering had grown into hundreds of people filling the hospital's courtyard. They stood shoulder to shoulder, each holding a flickering candle that transformed the growing darkness into a sea of golden light. "Can you see them all, Dad?" Ethan asked from his bed, where he sat propped up on extra pillows. Dr. Grace had bent the rules to let him stay awake for this. "I sure can." John's voice was soft with wonder. He recognized faces in the crowd. The checkout lady from the grocery store, mechanics from the auto shop down the street, teachers from Ethan's school. There were nurses and orderlies who had slipped him encouragement over the months, and countless others he'd never met but who had heard their story. A gentle knock at the door announced Grace's arrival. She entered quietly, carrying 3 battery-operated candles. "Thought you might want to join in," she said, handing them out. "No real flames allowed up here, but the sentiment's the same." Ethan clutched his plastic candle like it was made of gold. "Look, there's Pastor Mike," he pointed out the window, "and Mrs. Rodriguez from the bakery." John switched on his candle, the artificial flame casting a warm glow across his face. Down below, someone had started singing "Amazing Grace," the melody floating up through the evening air. Others joined in, their voices creating a gentle harmony that seemed to wrap around the hospital like a warm embrace. "They're not just here for me, are they, Dad?" Ethan asked thoughtfully, his young face serious in the candlelight. John shook his head. "No, buddy. They're here for all the kids like you, all the families who need help." He glanced at Grace, who nodded encouragingly. "Sometimes people just need to be reminded that we're all in this together." Through the window, they could see more people arriving, their candles adding to the constellation of lights below. Someone had hung a banner between 2 trees that read, "Hope heals all hearts." The sight made John's chest tight with emotion. A small group of children in wheelchairs had been brought outside to join the vigil, their faces glowing with wonder at the gathering. Their parents stood behind them, many wiping away tears as they held their own candles high. I wish I could be down there, Ethan said softly, pressing his hand against the window glass. You are, buddy. John placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder. Your story helped bring all these people together. Grace moved closer to the window, her own electric candle casting shadows on the wall. This is just the beginning, she said. People are listening now. They're seeing what matters. As the singing continued below, John felt something shift inside his heart. For months, he'd carried the weight of Ethan's illness alone, moving through his days like a shadow in the hospital halls. But now, looking out at the sea of lights, at all these faces turned up toward the hospital windows, he felt the isolation melting away. They weren't alone anymore. Each of those candles represented someone who cared, someone who believed that every child deserved a chance at life, regardless of their family's ability to pay. The realization brought fresh tears to John's eyes, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of despair. Ethan leaned against his father's side, his own candle held carefully in both hands. We're really not alone anymore, are we, Dad? John wrapped his arm around his son's thin shoulders, drawing him close. Below them, the crowd had started another song, this one about "Lean on Me when you're not strong." The melody drifted up through the growing darkness, carrying with it the promise of hope and the strength of community. No, son, John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. We're not alone at all. Dr. Grace Ramirez sat at her desk, sorting through a stack of patient files as morning sunlight streamed through her office window. The coffee beside her had long gone cold, forgotten in the rush of her morning rounds. Her phone buzzed, displaying the hospital board chairman's number. A small smile crossed her face, likely calling to finalize the details of Ethan's surgery fund. Dr. Ramirez speaking, she answered, already reaching for a pen to jot down notes. The voice on the other end was terse. Dr. Ramirez, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Grace's hand stilled over her notepad. Something in his tone made her stomach twist. Mr. Davidson, our primary donor for the Compassionate Care Fund, has just contacted us. The chairman cleared his throat. He's withdrawing his pledge. The pen slipped from Grace's fingers, clattering onto her desk. What? But he promised. Something about market fluctuations affecting his portfolio. He sends his regrets, but says he can no longer commit to the full amount. Grace pushed back from her desk, standing up so abruptly her chair rolled into the wall behind her. This can't be happening. The surgery is scheduled for next week. We have other donors. His contribution was meant to cover 60% of the program's funding. Without it. The chairman's voice trailed off. Grace pressed her free hand against her forehead, pacing the small confines of her office. There has to be something we can do. Give me time to find another donor. Dr. Ramirez. The chairman cut in, his tone gentler now. I understand your attachment to this case, but without secured funding, we'll have to postpone the surgery. Hospital policy. Policy? Grace's voice rose. We're talking about a 14-year-old boy's life. I'm sorry, truly, but we need to be realistic here. Grace sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly weak. Through her office window, she could see the hospital chapel across the courtyard, where she'd spotted John praying countless times. How could she tell him? How could she crush the hope they'd all worked so hard to build? I'll need to inform the family, she said quietly. Take the rest of the day if you need it. These conversations are never easy. Grace hung up the phone and buried her face in her hands. The silence of her office felt suffocating. After several long moments, she stood up, smoothing her white coat with trembling hands. She had to find John before he heard it from someone else. She stepped into the hallway, her footsteps heavy as she headed toward Ethan's wing. The usual bustle of hospital activity felt distant, as if she were walking through a fog. Nurses nodded to her as she passed, but she barely registered their greetings. Halfway there, she heard the cleaning cart before she saw it, the familiar squeak of its wheels against the linoleum floor. John was working his morning shift, methodically mopping the corridor while humming softly to himself. The sight of him, so peaceful and unaware, made her heart ache. But before she could reach him, she saw a group of administrators walking past, their voices carrying clearly in the quiet hallway. Davidson pulled out completely? Every penny. Said something about investing in a new development project instead. What about the Miller boys' surgery? Cancelled, unless they can find the money somewhere else. Grace watched in horror as John's mop handle slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly against the floor. He stood frozen, his face draining of color as the administrator's words registered. Their conversation halted abruptly as they noticed him, but the damage was done. John. Grace rushed forward as his knees began to buckle. He caught himself against the wall, his breathing ragged. "Tell me, it's not true," he whispered as she reached him. "Please, Dr. Ramirez, tell me they're wrong." The pain in his eyes made her own vision blur with tears. "I was coming to find you. I just got the call." A harsh coughing sound interrupted her, echoing from Ethan's room just down the hall. John's head snapped up, parental instinct overriding his own distress. The coughing grew more violent. "Ethan?" John pushed himself off the wall, stumbling toward his son's room. Grace ran beside him. They burst through the door to find Ethan hunched over in his bed, his face red as he struggled to breathe between coughs. The monitors beside him were beeping frantically. "Dad?" Ethan gasped, reaching out with one trembling hand before another coughing fit seized him. John rushed to the bed, gathering his son in his arms. "I'm here, buddy. I'm right here." His voice cracked as Ethan's body shook against him. Grace was already checking Ethan's vitals, her professional mask slipping back into place despite her own turmoil. "His oxygen levels are dropping. We need to—" Ethan's coughing suddenly stopped, his body going limp in John's arms. "Ethan!" John's voice rose in panic. "Ethan!" Grace hit the emergency call button, her hand steady even as her heart raced. "Code Blue!" she shouted into the hallway. "I need a team in here now!" The sound of running feet filled the corridor as John held his unconscious son, whispering desperate prayers through his tears. The morning sun continued to shine through the window, indifferent to the scene unfolding beneath its warm rays, while the machines beeped their urgent warning into the chaos of the room. The fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit cast harsh shadows across Ethan's pale face. Machines beeped steadily around him, marking each precious heartbeat. John watched from behind the glass window, his work uniform still on from his shift, the mop forgotten in some distant hallway when the emergency call had come. Ethan had collapsed during a particularly bad coughing fit. His heart, already struggling, couldn't keep up. Now tubes and wires snaked across his thin frame, making him look smaller than his 14 years. A nurse adjusted one of Ethan's 4 bags, checking the monitors with practiced efficiency. She caught John's eye through the window and gave him a sympathetic smile, but he could barely muster a nod in return. The weight of failure pressed down on his shoulders, making it hard to breathe. "Mr. Miller?" Another nurse touched his arm gently. "You should try to rest. We'll watch over him." John shook his head, his voice rough. I need to. But he couldn't finish the sentence. What did he need? A miracle. The money that had slipped through their fingers. The strength to keep fighting. All of it felt impossible now. His feet carried him away from the ICU, through corridors he'd cleaned thousands of times. Every corner held memories. Here was where he'd first begged Dr. Ramirez for help. There was where Ethan had taken his first steps after the initial treatments. Now those moments of hope felt like cruel jokes. The chapel door stood open, warm light spilling into the hallway. John hesitated at the threshold. He hadn't stepped foot in here since Sarah, Ethan's mother, had passed away. But tonight, his legs trembled with exhaustion and grief, and he needed somewhere to fall. The small room was empty, rows of wooden pews facing a simple altar. A rack of prayer candles flickered against one wall, casting dancing shadows. John's work-worn hand found the small Bible he always carried in his pocket. Sarah's Bible, really, with her neat annotations in the margins. He collapsed into the front pew, the Bible clutched to his chest, the quiet pressed in around him, broken only by his ragged breathing. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I did everything right. I worked hard. I never asked for handouts. Tears slid down his weathered cheeks. "I just want to save my boy." The memory of Ethan's smile that morning, weak but still bright with hope, twisted like a knife in his chest. His son had such faith in him, believed his father could move mountains. But in the end, John was just a janitor with empty pockets and a breaking heart. "Sarah," he murmured, thumbing through the worn pages of the Bible, "I wish you were here. You always knew what to do." His fingers found a passage she'd underlined years ago. The ink faded but still legible. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." A sob caught in his throat. How could he be strong when his world was crumbling? The fundraising, the community support, the board's tentative approval, all of it had felt like God's hand at work. Now that hope had turned to ashes in his mouth. He slid from the pew to his knees, still clutching the Bible. The cold floor reminded him of that night he'd knelt before Dr. Ramirez, desperate and humble. She'd shown such kindness then, such determination to help. But even her medical expertise couldn't conjure money from thin air. "Please," he prayed, his forehead pressing against his clasped hands. "I know I'm nobody special, just a janitor. But Ethan, he has so much life ahead of him. So much good to do. Don't take him from me. Not like Sarah. Please, not like Sarah." The chapel's silence held his grief, wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. Minutes or hours passed. John couldn't tell. His prayers became wordless, just the steady rhythm of his breathing and the weight of tears. Soft footsteps broke through his fog of despair. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. He'd heard those quick, purposeful steps in hospital corridors for months now. Dr. Grace Ramirez stood quietly in the aisle, her white coat exchanged for casual clothes, dark circles under her eyes betraying her own exhaustion. She looked at John for a long moment, then slowly sank onto the pew nearest to him. "I've been looking for you," she said softly. John couldn't meet her eyes. "I failed him," he whispered. "I promised him everything would be okay." "No." Grace's voice was firm despite its gentleness. "You fought harder than anyone I've ever seen. You moved this whole community. But it wasn't enough." The words tasted bitter. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then, to John's surprise, she slid down to kneel beside him on the chapel floor. "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" She waited for his slight nod before continuing. "When I lost my younger brother, I was already a doctor. All my training, all my knowledge, and I still couldn't save him. I felt like I'd failed in every way possible." John looked at her then, seeing the raw pain in her eyes that matched his own. "That's why Ethan's case," she swallowed hard. "I see my brother in him sometimes. That same spirit, that brightness, even when things are dark. And I'm terrified of failing again." Her honesty broke something open in John's chest. "I see Sarah in him every day," he admitted. "Her smile, her courage. I can't lose that twice." Grace reached out, taking one of the long matches used for the prayer candles. She struck it carefully, the flame illuminating their tear-stained faces. "When my grandmother was alive, she always said a candle was like a prayer made visible." She handed the match to John. "Would you light one with me?" Together, they stood. John's hands shook as he touched the flame to a fresh candle's wick. Grace lit one beside it, the two lights burning steady and bright in the quiet chapel. They stood there in silence, the candle's glow reflecting off the tears on their cheeks, each lost in their own prayers for the boy fighting for his life just a few floors above. In that moment, they weren't doctor and janitor, but simply two people united in their fear, their hope, and their desperate faith in miracles. The first rays of dawn filtered through the chapel's stained glass windows, painting the worn wooden pews in soft blues and golds. John's neck ached from sleeping awkwardly against the hard bench. His Bible lay open on his lap, the pages slightly crumpled where his hands had gripped them through the night. The peace of early morning was broken by urgent whispers outside the chapel doors. John rubbed his tired eyes, his work uniform wrinkled from the long night's vigil. The double doors creaked open, and Dr. Grace Ramirez slipped inside, her white coat exchanged for casual clothes that suggested she too had spent the night at the hospital. "John," she said softly, approaching with careful steps. "There are reporters outside. They heard about what happened with the donor pulling out, and about Ethan's condition." John's shoulders slumped. I can't. I don't have anything to say to them. His voice was hoarse from prayer and unshed tears. Grace sat beside him, the morning light catching the silver strands in her dark hair. Maybe that's exactly why you should speak to them, not with prepared speeches or practiced words. Just speak from your heart, John. Tell them what it means to be a father watching his child suffer. The chapel doors opened wider, and camera flashes lit up the sacred space. John instinctively turned away, but Grace's hand found his shoulder. You've been invisible for so long, she said, but people are finally listening. Make them hear you. John stood slowly, his legs stiff from the night, spent kneeling in prayer. The reporters clustered at the chapel entrance, microphones extended. Their eager faces reminded him of vultures, but then he noticed something else. Genuine concern in their eyes, a shared humanity that transcended their professional roles. Mr. Miller, how is your son? One reporter asked gently. John took a deep breath. The weight of his mop handle had been replaced by the heavier burden of truth. My son! His voice cracked, but he pressed on. My son Ethan is fighting for his life up there. He's 14 years old, likes baseball, makes terrible jokes that he thinks are hilarious. And last night, I watched him struggle to breathe. The cameras stopped flashing. The microphones lowered slightly. John wasn't speaking to them anymore. He was speaking to every parent who had ever feared for their child. I'm just a janitor, he continued, his voice growing stronger. I clean these floors every night. I'm the guy you don't notice when you walk past. But I'm also a father, and whether you mop floors or perform surgery or run a company, every parent knows that feeling when your child hurts and you can't fix it. Grace stood quietly behind him, her presence lending him strength. John's hands trembled, but his words flowed straight from his heart. We were so close. The hospital board was willing to help. People from our community stepped up. But now, he paused, swallowing hard. Now we're back to counting pennies while my boy's heart gives out. And I keep asking myself, what's the price tag on a child's life? How many floors do I need to mop? How many nights do I need to work? A young reporter wiped tears from her cheeks. Others had lowered their cameras entirely, caught up in the raw emotion of John's words. I'm not angry at the donor who pulled out. I'm not angry at anyone. I'm just a father, begging anyone who's listening, help me save my son. Help me keep him here long enough to grow up, to fall in love, to live the life his mother dreamed for him before she left us. John's voice finally broke. He sank back onto the pew, emotionally spent. Grace stepped forward, her own eyes glistening. The surgery Ethan needs costs more than some people make in a year, she explained to the reporters. But without it, this devoted father will lose his only child. We're not asking for one person to solve this, we're asking everyone to help carry this burden together. The reporters began rapidly typing on their phones. Camera crews huddled, reviewing footage. One journalist approached John carefully. Mr. Miller, would you mind if we shared your story? Not just locally, but with our national affiliates? John looked up, surprised. If it helps Ethan, if it helps other children like him, share it with whoever will listen. The news crews filed out quietly, with more respect than they had entered. Grace sat beside John, taking his hand. That was beautiful, she whispered. And true, every word. John's phone buzzed in his pocket, something that rarely happened. It was a text from one of the nurses upstairs who helped care for Ethan. John, she wrote, someone just posted a video of your speech online. It's being shared everywhere. People are asking how they can help. More notifications began flowing in. The local news station had already uploaded the clip. Community members were sharing it. Hearts and comments and promises of support multiplied by the minute. I didn't prepare anything, John said, dazed. I just told them the truth. Grace smiled, squeezing his hand. Sometimes the truth is more powerful than any prepared speech could ever be. You reminded everyone that behind every medical case, every policy decision, every funding debate, there's a human heart beating. Through the stained glass windows, the morning sun grew stronger, chasing away the shadows of night. John's phone continued to buzz with notifications. each one representing a person touched by his words, each share spreading ripples of hope beyond their small town. He stood up slowly, legs steadier now. "I should get back to Ethan." "Yes," Grace agreed. "He'll want to know his dad is becoming a social media sensation." John managed a weak chuckle. "He'll never let me hear the end of it." He paused at the chapel door, looking back at the place where he'd spent the darkest night of his life. "Thank you, Grace, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Together, they walked out of the chapel and toward the ICU, leaving behind the empty pews and the lingering echo of a father's love-filled words that were now traveling far beyond those sacred walls. In a spacious living room across town, retired Colonel James Barrett sat in his leather armchair, absently stirring his morning coffee while the local news played on his flat-screen TV. At 82, his morning routine rarely varied: coffee, news, then a walk if his knee permitted. But today would be different. The news anchor's voice caught his attention. "And now, we return to our coverage of the ongoing situation at Memorial Hospital, where a janitor's fight to save his son has captured the community's attention." The colonel's weathered hand froze mid-stir as John Miller's face appeared on the screen. The janitor stood outside the hospital, looking exhausted but determined. Though the colonel's memory wasn't what it used to be, something about that face tugged at his mind. "I'm not asking for myself," John's voice quavered slightly. "I'm asking for my boy, Ethan. He's 14, and he loves baseball, and—" John paused, swallowing hard. "Every night, even when he can barely breathe, he tells me not to worry, says he's going to be fine." The colonel leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. The camera zoomed in on John's face as he continued speaking, his words raw with emotion. "3 months ago, I was mopping these halls like any other night when my boy collapsed during his Little League game. Now he's fighting for his life. And I—" John's voice broke. "I clean these floors every night, hoping to earn enough for just one more treatment, one more day. But it's not enough. It's never enough." Suddenly, the colonel's memory clicked into place. 6 months ago, during his hip replacement surgery, he'd been unable to sleep one night. A kind janitor, this same man, had noticed his discomfort and brought him extra pillows, then stayed to chat about baseball when the colonel mentioned being a former minor league player. On screen, John was still speaking. "Some folks say we're asking for handouts, but every child deserves a chance to live, whether their daddy's a doctor or a janitor. I'm not ashamed to beg if it means saving my son, because that's what love does. It doesn't care about pride. It just keeps fighting." The colonel's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. That night in the hospital, John had shown him such kindness, refusing even a tip, saying it was just what decent folks did for each other. Now here he was, this humble man who'd helped a stranger in the night, fighting desperately for his son's life. The news segment continued, showing Dr. Grace Ramirez explaining Ethan's condition and the financial situation. The colonel listened intently, his jaw tightening at the mention of the donor who'd pulled out. As a veteran who'd served in 2 wars, he'd seen enough of death. But he'd also seen how a single act of kindness could ripple outward, changing lives in unexpected ways. With determined fingers, he dialed the hospital's number. After several transfers, he finally reached Dr. Ramirez's office. Dr. Ramirez speaking, came a tired voice. "Doctor, my name is Colonel James Barrett. I'm calling about John Miller's son." There was a pause. "Yes?" Her voice carried a guarded hope. 6 months ago, John Miller showed kindness to a grumpy old man who couldn't sleep after surgery. That man was me. Now it's time to return that kindness." The colonel's voice grew firm. "I want to fund Ethan's surgery. All of it." He heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Colonel Barrett, the amount needed." Grace began carefully. "I don't care about the amount," he interrupted gently. "I've been blessed with more money than I need, and no family left to leave it to. What better use than to save a child's life?" The silence on the other end stretched for a moment, then broke with the sound of quiet sobbing. The colonel waited patiently, understanding these were tears of relief, of hope restored. "Thank you," Grace finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much. "No need to thank me," the colonel replied softly. "Just tell John. Tell him I haven't forgotten those extra pillows, or our talk about baseball. Tell him that decent folks still look out for each other." He heard Grace break down completely then, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of answered prayers. The colonel smiled, picturing John's face when he would hear the news, imagining Ethan getting his chance at life. Sometimes, he thought, as he hung up the phone, the smallest acts of kindness came back as miracles. The hospital corridor buzzed with urgent activity as nurses and doctors rushed in and out of Ethan's room. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the sterile floor. John Miller stood by his son's bedside, his work-worn hand gently holding Ethan's smaller one. The machines beeped steadily, marking each precious heartbeat. Dr. Grace Ramirez entered the room, followed by her surgical team. Her face showed the calm professionalism she'd mastered over years of practice, but her eyes held a warmth that gave John strength. "It's time," she said softly, placing a reassuring hand on John's shoulder. "We need to prep him now." Ethan looked so small in the hospital bed, his skin pale against the white sheets. The baseball cap John had given him sat on the bedside table, a silent reminder of better days. Despite his weakness, Ethan managed a brave smile. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the medical equipment, "don't worry too much, okay?" John squeezed his son's hand, fighting back tears. "You're the bravest kid I know, buddy. You know that?" A nurse began checking Ethan's vital signs, while another adjusted his IV drip. The room filled with the quiet efficiency of medical preparation. John watched as they worked, his heart aching with every small wince from his son. "Mr. Miller," one of the nurses said gently, "we need to start getting him ready. You can stay until we move him." John nodded, not trusting his voice. He kept holding Ethan's hand as the medical team worked around them. Grace supervised everything, her attention to detail evident in every instruction she gave. "Remember when we used to practice pitching in the backyard?" John said, his voice thick with emotion. "You had the best curveball I'd ever seen." Ethan's eyes brightened slightly. "Better than Jimmy Carter's?" "Way better," John assured him, remembering their neighbor's son who played varsity baseball. "You'll be back out there soon, showing them all how it's done." The nurses began disconnecting some monitors to prepare for transport. Each beep and click seemed to echo in John's ears. Grace approached them again, her surgical cap already in place. "Ethan," she said, her voice warm but professional, "we're going to take good care of you. Your dad will be right here when you wake up." Ethan tried to put on a brave face, but John could see the fear in his eyes. "Promise you won't leave, Dad?" "Wild horses couldn't drag me away, buddy." John's voice cracked. "I'll be right here, waiting for you." The team began to raise the rails on Ethan's bed. Grace checked his charts one final time while the anesthesiologist introduced himself and explained what would happen next. John listened with half an ear, his focus entirely on memorizing every detail of his son's face. "I love you, Dad," Ethan whispered as they prepared to move him. "I love you too, son. So much." John leaned down and kissed his forehead, something he hadn't done since Ethan had declared himself too old for such things at 12. This time, Ethan didn't protest. The team began wheeling the bed toward the door. John walked alongside, still holding Ethan's hand, his steps matching the careful pace of the medical team. The corridor seemed endless, the journey to the operating room both too fast and agonizingly slow. At the double doors marked "Operating Room, Authorized Personnel Only," they paused. This was as far as John could go. He gave Ethan's hand one final squeeze. "See you soon, champ," he managed to say, forcing a smile onto his face. "You show them what a Miller is made of." Ethan nodded weakly, trying to smile back. Then the doors opened, and the team began moving him through. John watched as his son disappeared from view, his heart feeling like it might shatter. Grace lingered for a moment. "John," she said softly. He turned to her, his composure finally breaking. His legs gave way, and he fell into her waiting arms, his body shaking with silent sobs. "Please, save my son," he whispered, the words coming out as a prayer. The waiting room's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over John's tired face as he paced back and forth. His work boots squeaked against the polished floor with each turn, marking time like a metronome. 10 steps one way, pivot, 10 steps back. The ritual helped keep his racing thoughts at bay, if only barely. Mrs. Martinez from church sat quietly in the corner, her rosary beads clicking softly as she prayed. Next to her, Pastor Dave leafed through a worn Bible, occasionally glancing up to check on John. The retired nurse who'd first signed his petition, Sarah Wilson, brought him a paper cup of coffee that he accepted with trembling hands. "You should sit down, John," Sarah suggested gently. "You've been pacing for hours." John shook his head, took a sip of the bitter coffee. "Can't sit still. Not until I know." More people filtered in as the morning wore on. Mike from maintenance showed up during his break, still in his work uniform. A few nurses John knew from his night shifts stopped by between rounds, offering quiet words of encouragement. Even Dr. Thompson, who usually barely acknowledged the cleaning staff, came to squeeze John's shoulder before continuing his rounds. The waiting room slowly filled with an unlikely family brought together by one father's love for his son. Some brought food, sandwiches, cookies, fruit that sat untouched on the small table. Others brought prayers, hope, and silent support. Linda from the cafeteria arrived with her teenage daughter. "Remember when Ethan would help me sort the recycling after lunch?" she asked, her eyes misty. "Such a sweet boy, always wanting to help like his daddy." John managed a weak smile, remembering how proud he'd felt seeing Ethan volunteer during his hospital stays. Even sick, his boy thought of others. The hours crawled by like years. John's coffee grew cold, forgotten in his hand. Every time the double doors opened, his heart jumped, only to sink again when it wasn't Grace with news. Mary from the church choir started humming softly. "Amazing Grace." Others joined in, their gentle voices filling the sterile space with warmth. John closed his eyes, letting the familiar melody wash over him. A young orderly John knew as Tommy slipped in during his lunch break. "The whole pediatric floor is pulling for Ethan," he whispered. "Even Dr. Stevens lit a candle in the chapel, and you know how he is about religion." The gesture touched John deeply. Dr. Stevens had been one of the most vocal opponents of the charity program initially. Now here he was, praying for Ethan. It reminded John how this journey had changed not just him, but so many others. Pastor Dave stood up, stretching his stiff legs. "John, come sit with me a moment." He patted the chair next to him. "Tell me about that baseball game Ethan loved so much." John hesitated in his pacing, then slowly sank into the offered seat. "It was 3 years ago," he began softly. "His mom was still with us. Ethan caught a foul ball." The memory flowed out, bringing with it tears he couldn't hold back anymore. Mrs. Martinez reached over and took his hand. Others gathered closer, forming a protective circle around him. For a man who had spent so many years feeling invisible, the tangible support overwhelmed him. The clock on the wall ticked past noon. Then, 1 o'clock. 2. John resumed his pacing, unable to stay still any longer. Every so often, someone would offer him water or try to convince him to eat something. He couldn't. His stomach was tied in knots, so tight he could barely breathe. A group of nurses from the night shift arrived, still in their scrubs after their rotation. "We had to come," explained Jenny, who often worked the pediatric floor. "Ethan's one of ours too." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting long shadows across the floor. John watched them creep along, marking the passage of time. His legs ached from pacing, but he couldn't stop. Movement was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Someone had brought Ethan's baseball cap from his room. It sat on the small table like a talisman, its worn brim carrying years of memories. John picked it up, running his thumb over the team logo Ethan had traced so many times during long hospital nights. The double doors swung open again. This time, it was Grace. Her surgical cap was still on, and exhaustion lined her face, but she was smiling. The waiting room fell silent. "It went well," she said simply. The words hit John like a physical force. His legs gave way beneath him, and he dropped to his knees, clutching Ethan's baseball cap to his chest. Tears flowed freely as relief flooded through him, washing away months of fear and uncertainty. Around him, the room erupted in quiet celebrations and tearful thanks. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the recovery room with its reassuring rhythm. John sat beside Ethan's bed, his large, calloused hand gently holding his son's smaller one. Dark circles lined his eyes from the sleepless night, but he refused to look away from Ethan's face, watching for any sign of movement. Sunlight streamed through the window blinds, painting stripes across the white hospital sheets. The morning shift had begun, bringing with it the distant sounds of cartwheels and quiet conversations in the hallway. A fresh bouquet of flowers from the church ladies brightened the windowsill, their sweet fragrance mixing with the sterile hospital air. John's thumb traced small circles on the back of Ethan's hand, just as he used to do when Ethan was small and afraid of thunderstorms. The simple gesture brought back memories of nights spent reading baseball statistics together, of teaching Ethan how to hold a mop just right when he'd visit Dad at work, of shared meals in their modest apartment, where laughter made up for what they lacked in fancy food. A slight flutter of Ethan's eyelids caught John's attention. His breath caught in his throat as he leaned forward, hardly daring to hope. "Ethan?" he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Son?" Slowly, ever so slowly, Ethan's eyes began to open. They were cloudy at first, struggling to focus in the bright room. John's vision blurred with tears as he watched his son return to consciousness, each blink bringing more awareness to those familiar brown eyes, his mother's eyes. "Dad?" Ethan's voice was barely audible, scratchy from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier. His fingers twitched weakly in John's grasp. The dam broke. Tears streamed freely down John's weathered cheeks as he pressed Ethan's hand to his forehead. "I'm here, buddy. I'm right here." His shoulders shook, with silent sobs of relief, joy, and lingering fear all mixed together. "Did we?" Ethan paused, gathering strength. "Did we win?" A wet laugh escaped John's throat. Trust his son to think of their fight even now. "Yeah, champion. We won. You won." He wiped his eyes with his free hand, not caring who might see. "How do you feel?" Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile. "Like I got tackled by the whole Yankees team." He tried to shift position and winced. "But good. Better than before." John reached for the cup of ice chips the nurse had left. "Here, small sips." He helped Ethan take a few, handling the plastic spoon as carefully as if it were made of gold. "Your heart's strong now. Dr. Grace fixed it up real good." "She promised she would." Ethan's voice was getting clearer. His eyes roamed the room, taking in the flowers, cards, and small stuffed animals that had accumulated during his surgery. "Wow, all this for me? The whole town's been pulling for you, buddy." John smoothed Ethan's hair back from his forehead, a gesture he'd done countless times over the years. "You've got quite a fan club out there." A soft knock at the door preceded Dr. Grace's entrance. She looked tired, but happy. Her usual pristine appearance slightly rumpled after the long surgery and subsequent monitoring. Her face lit up when she saw Ethan awake. "There's our star patient," she said warmly, moving to check his vitals. "How are you feeling, Ethan?" "Like a champion," Ethan replied, trying to sound stronger than he was. "Dad says you fixed my heart." Grace's skilled hands moved efficiently as she examined him, but her touch was gentle. "Your heart was already pretty special," she said. "I just helped it work better." She glanced at the monitors, nodding in satisfaction. "Everything looks excellent. The surgery went perfectly." John watched her work, remembering how she'd knelt beside him that night in the corridor, how she'd fought for them when no one else would. His voice was thick with emotion when he spoke. "Dr. Grace, I don't know how we can ever thank you." She paused in her examination, turning to face him fully. Her eyes were soft with understanding as she looked at this father who had moved mountains for his son. "Your faith saved him as much as medicine did," she said quietly. "Love like yours. That's the strongest medicine there is." Spring sunshine warmed the hospital garden, casting dappled shadows through the budding trees. Ethan Miller took careful steps along the stone pathway, his father's steady hand supporting his elbow. Though still pale, color had returned to his cheeks, and his eyes sparkled with determination. "Easy there, buddy. John said softly, matching his son's careful pace. "We've got all morning." Ethan nodded, pausing to catch his breath near a wooden bench decorated with climbing roses. "I'm okay, Dad. Just need a minute." He lowered himself onto the bench, his hand automatically going to his chest, a habit he'd developed since the surgery. John sat beside him, his janitor's uniform crisp and clean for the afternoon ceremony. He'd pressed it specially the night before, wanting to look his best. The garden around them buzzed with activity as hospital staff set up chairs and a small podium near the central fountain. "Nervous about your speech?" Ethan asked, noticing his father's fingers drumming against his knee. John chuckled. "That obvious, huh?" He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, covered in his careful handwriting. "Never thought I'd be doing anything like this, speaking in front of all those people. You'll do great." Ethan's confidence in his father never wavered. "Just tell them what you told me, about how everyone deserves a chance." A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers, and somewhere nearby, a bird sang. John watched as more hospital staff appeared, carrying stacks of chairs and promotional materials with Compassionate Care Fund printed in bold letters. Dr. Grace approached them, clipboard in hand, and a warm smile on her face. "There's my favorite walking partner," she said to Ethan. "How many laps today?" "Half of one," Ethan admitted with a sheepish grin. "But it's better than yesterday." "Progress is progress," Grace agreed, sitting on Ethan's other side. "And speaking of progress, John, the press will be here in an hour. Are you ready?" John smoothed his uniform nervously. "Ready as I'll ever be. Still can't believe they want me to speak first." "Of course they do," Grace said firmly. "This fund exists because of you and Ethan. Your story showed everyone why we need it." More people began filtering into the garden. Nurses John had worked alongside for years, doctors who'd treated Ethan, volunteers who'd helped with the petition drive. They waved or called out greetings as they passed, and John marveled at how different it felt from just months ago when he'd been invisible to most of them. "Look," Ethan pointed to a group of children being wheeled into the garden by their parents. "Those kids are from the pediatric ward. They came to watch you, Dad." John's throat tightened as he recognized some of the faces, children he'd seen during his late-night cleaning shifts, kids whose parents he'd noticed sleeping in uncomfortable chairs beside their beds. Now they were here, their faces bright with hope. "Mr. Miller," a young nurse approached, holding a box. "We have your new badge." She handed him a hospital ID card that read, "John Miller, Patient Advocate, Facilities Management." "Thank you," John said softly, running his thumb over the title. It still felt surreal, how his role had expanded beyond just keeping the floors clean. Now he split his time between janitorial duties and helping families navigate the healthcare system, sharing his hard-won knowledge with others in need. The garden continued filling with people. Church members arrived, carrying platters of food for the reception. Local reporters set up cameras near the podium. The hospital board members appeared in their suits and dresses, looking unusually approachable as they mingled with the crowd. Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve. "Can we walk a little more? I want to be stronger for the ceremony." "You sure, buddy?" John studied his son's face for any signs of fatigue. "I'm sure." Ethan stood carefully, and together they resumed their slow circuit of the garden. They passed the spot where John had first collapsed to his knees, begging Dr. Grace for help. Now that same spot held a decorative plaque announcing the Compassionate Care Fund's mission: "No child turned away, no family left behind." Hospital administrators bustled around, making last-minute adjustments to the podium and sound system. The garden filled with the buzz of conversation and the occasional laugh. John recognized faces from the community meetings, the church gatherings, the candlelight vigil, all the people who'd helped make this day possible. "5 minutes, everyone," Grace called out, gesturing for people to take their seats. John helped Ethan to a chair in the front row, then straightened his uniform one last time. He could feel his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded his speech. "Dad?" Ethan caught his sleeve before he could walk away. "Remember what you told me in the chapel that night? About how love is stronger than fear?" John nodded, remembering those dark hours when he thought he might lose everything. "Well," Ethan continued, his eyes bright, "you proved it. You weren't afraid to fight for me, and now you're helping other families fight too." The microphone squealed with feedback as someone tested it. Chairs scraped against stone as the last audience members settled in. Cameras clicked, and reporters readied their notepads. The hospital CEO approached the podium, shuffling his notes. Before beginning the official proceedings, he caught John's eye and gave him a respectful nod, something that would have been unthinkable just months ago. John stood at the edge of the crowd, speech in hand, watching as his son sat tall in his chair, as Grace took her place among the other doctors, as families with sick children filled the rows of seats. His uniform might not be as fancy as the suits around him, but he stood straight and proud, ready to tell their story one more time. The CEO stepped up to the microphone, and the garden fell quiet, except for the gentle splash of the fountain and the continuing song of birds. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of the Compassionate Care Fund. The hospital's main conference hall had been transformed for the evening. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in white linens, each decorated with fresh spring flowers. Where doctors usually discussed medical cases, tonight hundreds of community members gathered to celebrate the launch of the Compassionate Care Fund. Ethan sat in the front row, wearing a new blue suit that the church ladies had pitched in to buy him. Though still thin, his cheeks had a healthy flush, and his eyes sparkled with pride as he watched his father adjust his tie nervously backstage. Dr. Grace stood beside John, smoothing down his borrowed jacket lapels. "Remember to breathe," she whispered, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Just speak from your heart, like you always do." John nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he held his note cards. Through the curtain, he could hear the steady murmur of conversation from the gathered crowd. Hospital staff, local business owners, church members, and even some faces he didn't recognize. The same halls where he had once mopped floors unnoticed now held people who had come to hear him speak. The hospital administrator approached the podium, tapping the microphone. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight marks a historic moment for our community." She paused, scanning the room. "Many of you know the remarkable story that brings us here. But for those who don't, let me introduce you to a man who taught us all about the power of faith, perseverance, and love." John's breath caught in his throat as she continued. "We don't often think about the quiet heroes who walk among us, the ones who clean our halls, who pray in our chapel late at night, who never give up fighting for their children. Tonight's speaker isn't just a janitor, though he has served this hospital faithfully for 15 years. He's not just a single father, though his dedication to his son has moved us all to tears. John Miller is a reminder that one person's courage can awaken the conscience of an entire community." In the front row, Ethan beamed. Several nurses seated nearby reached over to pat his shoulder. The retired veteran philanthropist who had funded his surgery sat beside him, nodding approvingly. "Please welcome to the podium," the administrator continued, "our dear friend and inspiration for the Compassionate Care Fund, Mr. John Miller." The applause that followed was deafening. John stepped out from behind the curtain, blinking in the bright lights. As he made his way to the podium, he caught sight of Ethan's encouraging smile. His son gave him a subtle thumbs up, and suddenly the nervousness melted away. John cleared his throat, setting aside his note cards. "Thank you," he began softly, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You know, for years I walked these halls with a mop and bucket, trying my best to be invisible. I never imagined I'd be standing here tonight, speaking to all of you." He paused, his eyes finding Ethan's face in the crowd. "My son taught me that being invisible isn't an option when someone you love needs you to be brave. When Ethan got sick, I thought I was alone in my fight, but I learned something beautiful about this community, about all of you." Tears glistened in his eyes, but his voice remained steady. "I learned that hope isn't something we hold alone. It's something we share, something we protect for each other. Every person who signed our petition, who attended our vigils, who slipped an envelope into my locker, you weren't just helping one janitor and his son. You were showing what's possible when we refuse to look away from each other's pain." Grace watched from the side of the stage, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. In the audience, several people nodded, some wiping away their own tears. "This fund," John continued, gesturing to the large display behind him, "isn't just about money. It's about saying that every life has value. Every child deserves a chance. Every parent's prayers matter. He smiled gently. And every person, no matter their job or their bank account, deserves to be seen. The room was absolutely silent now, hanging on his every word. John's voice filled with warmth as he reached his conclusion. You know, I've spent 15 years keeping these halls clean, but I've learned that we all have an even more important job. Whether we're doctors or janitors, nurses or patients, wealthy or struggling, we're all responsible for keeping hope alive. We're all custodians of each other's hope. The audience rose as one, erupting in thunderous applause. Ethan was the first on his feet, tears streaming down his face as he clapped proudly for his father. The sound rolled through the hall like a wave, growing louder as people whistled and cheered. John stood at the podium, humbled by the response, his own eyes shining with grateful tears as the applause continued to fill the room. The invisible janitor had found his voice, and in doing so had helped an entire community find its heart. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window of the Miller home, painting golden patterns across the worn wooden table. The familiar scent of pancakes and coffee filled the air, mingling with something even more precious, the sound of Ethan's laughter. John flipped another pancake, stealing glances at his son who sat at the table, already demolishing his second helping. Ethan's chest scar peeked out from his t-shirt collar, but it was no longer an object of fear. Instead, it had become a badge of survival, a reminder of their journey. "Dad, you're burning it!" Ethan called out, grinning, as John quickly rescued the slightly darkened pancake. "I like them with character," John replied, sliding the pancake onto his own plate. He sat down across from Ethan, marveling at how different their mornings were now compared to those endless days in the hospital. Ethan reached for the syrup, drizzling it generously. "Remember when the hospital food was so bad I made you smuggle in burgers? And Dr. Grace caught us red-handed." John chuckled, shaking his head. "I thought she'd be mad, but she just asked for a French fry instead. She's coming to my baseball practice next week, you know," Ethan said between bites. "She wants to see me pitch again." John's heart swelled. 6 months after the surgery, Ethan had slowly worked his way back to the baseball diamond. His first throw had been wobbly and weak, but now his fastball was coming back, stronger every day. "Coach Martinez says I might even start in the game next month," Ethan continued, his eyes bright with excitement. "Can you believe it, Dad?" John remembered those dark nights when baseball seemed like an impossible dream, when even breathing was a struggle for Ethan. Now here they were, talking about starting positions and practice schedules. "I believe it," John said softly. "You're the strongest person I know, kiddo." Ethan rolled his eyes, but his smile widened. "You have to say that. You're my dad." "No, I say it because it's true." John reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "You never gave up, even when things were at their worst." "Neither did you," Ethan replied, suddenly serious. "Everyone at school still talks about how you fought for me. Tommy Peterson's mom cries every time she sees me. It's kind of embarrassing, actually." John laughed, remembering Mrs. Peterson's tearful hugs at church. The community that had rallied around them during their darkest hours remained steadfast friends. The hospital's new Compassionate Care Fund had already helped 3 other families, and John served on its advisory board. Quite a change from his days mopping floors. "Hey, pass the bacon," Ethan said, breaking John's reverie. "And did you see my math test? Miss Williams said I aced it." "That's fantastic," John beamed. Ethan's recovery had been matched by his determination to catch up on the schoolwork he'd missed. "We should celebrate. How about ice cream after practice today?" "Can we invite Dr. Grace?" Ethan asked, pushing his empty plate away. "She mentioned wanting to try that new place downtown." "Sure thing," John nodded, watching as Ethan bounded up from his chair with an energy that still amazed him. Just months ago, walking to the bathroom had been an ordeal. Now his son moved with the restless energy of any typical teenager. Ethan disappeared into his room and returned with his baseball glove, already worn from frequent use. "I'm going to practice my grip on the porch. You coming, Dad?" "Let me clean up first," John called after him, gathering their breakfast dishes. As he stood at the sink, he could hear Ethan's footsteps on the porch boards, the familiar sound of a ball being caught and thrown against the mitt. The morning light caught the edges of the framed newspaper article hanging on their kitchen wall, the story of their fight for the Compassionate Care Fund. Beside it hung Ethan's first post-surgery baseball photo, his grin wide and fearless under his team cap. John's hands stilled in the soapy water as gratitude overwhelmed him. He thought of Dr. Grace, of her skilled hands that had given Ethan back his future, of her compassionate heart that had given them both hope when they needed it most. "Thank you, God," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She saved my son and gave us back our life." "Come on, Dad," Ethan called from the porch. "Let's play catch. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you thought this was just the beginning, you're right. Click through and see where the story takes you next. If you enjoyed the story of John Miller, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.